Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible, both from Milligan College, as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday School lesson for the day. Now, here is Dr. Magnus.
What a pleasure to have you join us for another lesson in the Word. We're continuing our study of the overall theme of justice, and we're now looking at some of Paul's writings in the letters, and we've come to the fascinating Corinthian correspondence, two letters written by Paul to one of the largest cities in the empire. It was undergoing a big economic boom, and the congregation was booming as well, and Paul has some important advice for them that speaks directly to us as well. Good day to you, Dr. Roberts.
Good to be here again.
Glad you're with us as we continue this series and move to another important Pauline letter. The Corinthian letters are fascinating, aren't they?
They are, yes.
Yeah, we talked a little bit last week about how Romans was written to a congregation that Paul didn't know very well.
He knew Corinth.
But he really
He'd started
knew
the
Corinth.
church
and
been there as their initial pastor, preacher, evangelist, but then time moved on and situations changed, and so he got reports of what was going on and began to write to them.
Yeah. He kept very close. Not only had he spent a long time there, year and a half to 2 years, he had regular emissaries who went there. Titus took trips there. Timothy took trips there. Silas had been there since he had, and so got regular reports. And then at the beginning of the third missionary journey, he went to the city of Ephesus, which is in Turkey. Corinth is in Greece, but they're directly across the Aegean Sea from each other, and there's a lot of communication there. There was. And so Paul was able to have visitors, get letters.
People came from there.
And so he knew a lot all through this period of the mid-decades of the 50s. He knew a lot about what was going on there. Now, 1 Corinthians is a problem-solving kind of letter.
Yes.
With emphasis on problems.
Right. There were a lot of problems.
We don't have time to rehearse all the problems they were facing, but rest assured, there were a lot of problems in that congregation, and Paul deals with them very directly and forthrightly in what we call 1 Corinthians. And as a result, probably rubbed a few people the wrong way.
He ruffled some feathers.
Because he corrects people in all kinds of things. He scolds them for a lack of congregational unity, chides some of the members about some immoral sexual behavior, on and on the list goes. Corrects views.
Abuses in worship.
Abuses in worship, misunderstanding of the marital relationship and singleness, just all kinds of things there. So as a result, many of the things in Corinth got corrected by his teaching, but there were also deep, hard feelings between.
Apparently so.
Yeah.
And there were some criticisms of Paul, and whether they came from friends or foe, they hurt.
Yeah.
And Paul reacts. I can remember when I was a kid, my sister was older, and she was really bothered by some of Paul's writings because he was constantly patting himself on the back. And our minister at the time said, "You're only looking at one part of the correspondence." There are some people who were criticizing Paul, and he's defending himself, and especially defending his apostleship.
That's the key. He wasn't so much defending his own honor the way we sometimes do when we're criticized or attacked. But Paul knew that if his apostolic call and ministry was questioned and undermined, it would work not to his detriment, but to the detriment of the gospel.
Right.
And so that's why in several of his letters, like Galatians, and here in 2 Corinthians, Paul got what feels defensive. But that's very important that you clarified. It's a defensiveness for his apostolic mission and the gospel, not just himself as a person.
Yeah.
Well, as a result, 2 Corinthians, which is the letter that we're studying from today, has sections that sound very defensive, especially those last 4 chapters.
And some question whether it's all one letter or may have been a composite of a couple of letters or even 3 letters.
Yeah.
Some theories.
We do know that Paul wrote multiple letters to this congregation, more than just 2.
He refers to them.
He refers to that, so this could be a composite of several of those letters. But it does have wild swings in tone, so either it's different letters or one letter that he put down and took up again later when he was in a different mood. So it's an oddly shaped letter. It's got these defensive passages that we've been talking about, but then there are also some beautiful passages talking about his reconciliation with the congregation, because clearly many of the people there had come around and had learned from 1 Corinthians and were kind of back on the same wavelength with Paul.
Yeah.
So chapter 5 has that beautiful section about reconciliation.
Yes.
So it's an interesting letter. Right in the middle of all of this swirling interpersonal conflict is a very important project that Paul is promoting during his 3rd missionary journey.
He's concerned about the church back in Judea, the church at Jerusalem, that was really the founding church for the others where the missionaries had gone out to start new churches, including Corinth.
Yep.
And so that was the mother church, if you will.
Right. Now, why was he concerned about that?
Things were tough there economically. In that Palestinian culture, in the Jewish situation, as people became Christians, they were excluded from society and from the economy in some ways. And there was a real serious issue of poverty in the church.
Yeah, so many of the Jewish Christians there in Jerusalem might have been fired from their jobs because of their conversion to Christ, or disowned by their families. And so that puts them under economic strain. Another factor is that Palestine in general is more subject to weather and crop problems than, say, Corinth was, which was a mercantile society. It wasn't based on agriculture so much. So if there were bad seasons, they didn't really feel it in Corinth.
Yeah.
You really felt it back in Palestine, which was still a largely agricultural area, and that may have led to some of the poverty in the church there as well. You know, another interesting factor is that the generosity of the Jerusalem church had also caused, I'll say, some of their financial hard times. They had been so generous in the early days, giving generously and extravagantly to those who were in need in their congregation, and then, as you say, to support evangelistic efforts throughout the empire. So Paul is very aware. Now, there is another factor that lies behind Paul's eagerness for Gentile churches to send money to Jerusalem, and that is Paul's eagerness to maintain unity between Gentile Christians and Jewish Christians.
Yes, that was such an issue in Corinth, where, as you mentioned in 1 Corinthians, he's been so concerned about the unity of the congregation of the church, and it's more than that one congregation or church. It's the fellowship of Christians around the world, and this Jewish-Gentile barrier or wall, as he talks about in Ephesians, has been broken down in Christ, but you need to make sure it's evident in how we live.
Walls like that tend to start creeping up higher again,
That's right.
Don't they? Since we have these kind of, I'll call them natural differences of religion, culture, ethnicity. And so Paul is so resolved to keep that kind of unity across the Jew-Gentile divide that he saw this collection and this gift, I think, as a way for them to maintain contact with each other.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's why, according to Acts chapter 20, he didn't just collect money from the churches of Turkey and Greece. Okay. He collected congregational representatives,
yes,
right?
The people with him.
Yeah, so that they would personally go to Jerusalem with him and present the gifts. So here, Gentile Christians actually meeting with Jewish Christians in
Whether
this
those
generosity.
were short-term mission trips, I don't know. You know.
Yeah, right, right. But that's very important. Like even today, it's one thing to send money to a missionary. It's another thing to send members of your congregation to see the work, to encourage them in the work right on site.
Yeah.
It helps with unity around the world that way. Well, that's the context. On the third missionary journey, one of Paul's most important tasks, besides evangelism and church planting, is to take up this collection. It's referred to in several of his letters.
Yes,
it's in Romans, it's in Galatians, and it's referenced also in the book of Acts later on. So, and it's chapters 8 and 9. We're just in chapter 8, but
and these two chapters are the stewardship chapters of the New Testament.
They really are.
And, and if you've ever been in a church where there's an offering meditation, quite often it comes from 2 Corinthians 8 and 9.
As well it should.
Yes.
Because this is the most sustained discussion of Christian generosity anywhere in the New Testament.
And Paul makes some excellent points here about what it means to give and why.
Yeah. Now, we are going to begin our study of the scriptural text in chapter 8, verse 7. So let's say a quick word about those first 6 verses, because they're very important.
Yes, he starts off talking about the churches in Macedonia who had committed to help. And they weren't doing well financially.
Let's get our geography straight here. Macedonia is northern Greece, and Corinth was in southern Greece, which was called Achaia. It's kind of the booming section, and most of the Christians up in Macedonia seem, as you say, to be not quite as well off. In fact, maybe even struggling financially.
Paul talks about it. It's tough times there.
But these wonderful first 6 verses are Paul's commendation of the amazing generosity of the Macedonian Christians.
Yes. They didn't have money, but they gave it anyway.
There's this one statement. It says, their extreme poverty overflowed in a wealth of generosity. How do you take, how does extreme poverty overflow with anything?
When the bucket's empty, you think it's empty.
How do you pour anything out of an empty bucket? But that's exactly what he says. And he says they gave with joy. They gave in spite of affliction. That may have been persecution. Or it may just have been economic difficulty. So we have these beautiful statements. Oh, it's also there that Paul begins this theme of they gave according to their means.
Yes. A very important point.
And we saw that principle back in the early chapters of Acts, where even back in Jerusalem, the generosity was never a certain amount of money. It wasn't a pledge. There isn't even talk of tithing there. It's just that people gave what they could.
When there was a need, people responded. Barnabas had property on the island of Cyprus, sold it so that he could give money to the church. Now, Ananias and Sapphira decided to get the credit without giving much of what they'd gotten.
But that principle of giving according to your means has been in the church right along. He goes on to say of the Macedonian Christians that they gave beyond their means. We call that sacrificial giving.
And they gave themselves first.
Yes.
That's a critical part.
Yes. In other words, it wasn't just a gift of money. It was an outflow of a kind of a life of generosity and sharing. So we're studying, beginning in verse 7, but we really urge our viewers to go back and look at those first 6 verses. And in fact, to go ahead and read the rest of chapter 8 and all of chapter 9.
Sure.
Because it goes together in Paul's great teaching about Christian generosity.
Yeah.
All right, well, we better get to our text here today. We start in 2 Corinthians 8:7. But since you excel in everything, in faith and speech and knowledge and complete earnestness, and in the love we have kindled in you, see that you also excel in this grace of giving. I'm not commanding you, but I want to test the sincerity of your love by comparing it with the earnestness of others. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, that you, through his poverty, might become rich. And here's my judgment about what's best for you in this matter. Last year, you were the first, not only to give, but also to have the desire to do so. Now, finish the work, so that your willingness to do it may be matched by your completion of it, according to your means. For if the willingness is there, the gift is acceptable, according to what one has, not according to what one does not have. Our desire is not that others might be relieved while you are hard-pressed, but that there might be equality. In the present time, your plenty will supply what they need, so that in turn their plenty will supply what you need. The goal is equality. As it is written, the one who gathered much did not have too much, and the one who gathered little did not have too little.
Very good. And Paul starts off really commending them. You excel in everything.
It's a commendation, but with a little barb attached, don't you think?
You excel in everything, but.
Yeah. One is the contrast. You excel in everything, but your generosity may be lagging a little bit. You may be in need. The other thing is that there's a little bit of irony here, because several of the items in the list of verse 7 were areas that he scolded them about
in 1 Corinthians.
In 1 Corinthians. Right. So when he says you excel in speech, he actually had to correct their use of tongue speaking, that kind of speech in their worship services.
And in knowledge, there was apparently a division over either education or wisdom or whatever, but the IQ level, some way or other, was separating people.
Right. And so he has to scold them about an arrogance about worldly knowledge. So there's a little bit of irony in this list, but I mean, it's also sincere. They were abounding in these things. I think the word faith here probably doesn't mean, it's not that one of us has a better faith in Jesus than the other. Faith in Jesus is faith in Jesus. It's more a faithfulness, living out of our faith is the idea there. So that is verse 7, and he uses this as a way of saying there is an area of your life and your Christian witness that probably could be improved on, and it is this area of generosity.
I think what he's saying, that they're good, strong Christians, but like as Jesus told the rich young ruler, you lack one thing, the grace of giving.
And so he chides them about that a little bit and challenges them in the next few verses. Now, it's interesting the way he challenges them. In verse 8, he does it by a little bit of comparison. This is a dangerous game to play.
He starts off, I'm not commanding you, which sounds like Philemon. Where I don't want to tell you what to do, but
I know you'll do whatever I say, right? Yeah. So there is that. But he says, I want to put you to the test, the sincerity of your love, by comparing you to the earnestness of others. That kind of comparison of one Christian to another is a potentially dangerous game to play, but he takes the risk.
Yeah.
And in fact, he's already started out the chapter by comparing them to the Macedonian Christians in a way.
But he's not saying the size of your check.
Mm-hmm.
It's the earnestness.
Good.
It's the
yeah.
desire.
So it's not. Yeah. It's a comparison, but not
Yeah.
not in the amount. So that's one way he challenges them by saying, now, come on, look at the example of your fellow Christians, and you step up like they did. So that's one challenge. The second challenge is for them to look at the example of Jesus, and that's in verse 9.
Yes.
Very fascinating there, where he's thinking about, it kind of reminds you of Philippians chapter 2, even though he was equal with God, that was not something to be clung to,
Yeah.
so he emptied himself.
I think about out of the ivory palaces,
Huh.
Jesus came to live
Yeah.
among us, and it impressed me several years ago. I'd read it all my life, the story of the Nativity, that when Jesus was taken to the temple to be presented, they offered 2 turtle doves, 2
doves.
pigeons.
Yeah.
Normally, you were to offer a lamb.
Right.
But the Old Testament says, in case of poverty, you can give the, and so they were poor.
Jesus was literally born into a poverty-stricken family. Yeah. So verses 8 and 9 give us those 2 examples that can challenge us to be generous. But then verses 10 and following tell us that there is something else, a needed ingredient besides the positive example of fellow Christians and the positive example of our Lord, and that is desire, intent,
through.
a willingness. Yeah. And that's what he emphasizes in verses 10 and following. In verse 10 we see the word desire. Then in verse 11, eager willingness. Verse 12, willingness again. So that's really the key there, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And his point is that you were concerned, you made a commitment, you gave a little bit. Now follow through, finish up.
Yeah. You filled out a pledge card. Now,
Right.
now do it, huh?
Yeah.
Well, that is really important, and Paul focuses on that aspect in 3 verses. So you might think, well, it's enough that Jesus did it, so we should do it, or it's enough that we see a good example in fellow Christians, so we should do it. But Paul says, at some point, your heart, your spirit, your will needs to get involved.
Right.
And in any kind of Christian enterprise, but that's especially true in generosity. And for him, it becomes a matter of, follow through. That was your term, wasn't it?
And the title of the lesson this week is Giving Justly. And it's recognizing that this is what I need to do. It's part of what God has allowed me to do.
Yeah. It sounds like from verse 10 that they had gotten excited about this collection at first and had jumped right in and maybe set some money aside, but now some time has passed and they've forgotten about it and haven't done that. Well, the verses 13 and 14 are interesting because they introduce this concept of equality or balance or sameness is another way to translate it. I think one thing, of course, we need to be careful of here is that Paul isn't teaching that all Christians have to have the same income or the same amount of money.
It's not a communism issue.
No. Obviously, there were some wealthy Christians and there were some poorer Christians, and Paul doesn't act like that is a problem. The balance that he's talking about here is a balance of generosity, not of income or bank accounts, but that we always stand ready, like Barnabas, who seems to be a person of means and property, but he stood ready at any time to relinquish some of his property in order to meet a legitimate financial need.
Right.
That's from Acts chapter 4.
Right.
Yeah.
And the point here is that Jerusalem has a need, and there was a time when they gave for you. Now you can give for them.
Yeah.
And it's not tit for tat, equal.
Yeah.
But they gave and you can give.
Yeah. And Christian generosity isn't necessarily giving in kind. It's not as if I'm having hard times and you gave me a loan, and then later on you're having financial hard times, so I give you a loan. It's not necessarily like that. Jerusalem had already been very generous by giving their leaders and congregation members to be evangelists, of which the Corinthian congregation was a beneficiary.
Yeah.
But now, Corinth can turn around and give Jerusalem what Jerusalem needs. They don't need evangelists. They do need money.
Yeah.
Now.
And Corinth was in the situation where they could give it. And you know, I think in looking at this, we're so familiar with John 3:16, which is obviously a tremendous scripture passage. But 1 John 3:16 through 18 talks about how God first loved us and Jesus gave himself for us. Now we need to give for one another. If we see a brother or sister in need, we can't shut our eyes and our hearts against them.
Right. And yet we don't expect people to return to us. I had a dear aunt who refused to come to our Christmas gatherings when she reached her upper 80s, and I finally went to pick her up one Christmas, and she didn't want to come, and I finally got out of her. She was embarrassed because she didn't have much money at that point in her life, and we would give her presents, and she couldn't afford to give us presents. And I was thoughtful enough to explain to her at the time. I said, Aunt Margaret, you gave your whole life to us when we were little kids. Maybe not money, but fun times and activity and spending the night at your place. And now we're giving to you. And so we don't always return the same gift identically, but we are eager to be generous to one another. So,
in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, Paul has so many good things to say about the fact that God has given gifts to us and given us the privilege of giving, and we reap what we sow. It's a matter of recognizing that you can't stop the flow here.
That's a good point.
Yeah, we need to give.
I hope our viewers go on and look at chapter 9. It is also so beautiful, and one of the points that chapter 9 makes is that God expects us to be the conduits of his generosity to other people. Yeah, we might say, well, God helps those who help themselves. You know, God will take care of their needs. But chapter 9 makes it very clear that that's not the way Paul sees it. God always helps other people in need through his supply to us.
Right.
And that's why this passage closes with a little reminder of the story of the manna, where everybody had enough.
Right.
No, if you hoarded it and had a whole lot extra, it just rotted. But everybody needs to at least have enough. And I think that's a concept that we need to take seriously.
It's giving justly.
As fellows, there you go, giving justly. Thanks so much for joining us today and participating in our conversation. I hope you've heard some things that are challenging to you and provocative to your thinking. And as we all try to live up to the example of Jesus in this area of generosity. Hope you can join us again next time as we continue our study in the Word.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson with Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible from Milligan College, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible of Milligan College. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of the First Christian Church Television Ministries.